It's such a pleasure to welcome Love Sober's Kate Baily to I Am, I Have Today. Kate is a certified professional sobriety and life coach, specializing in holistic well-being for women in midlife, perimenopause transition, sobriety, and stress management. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, Lucy.
Thank you so much for your beautiful book, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And I've just done a short introduction to what you do, but I wondered if you could tell us about yourself in your own words.
I am a sobriety and well-being coach for women, and I co-founded a community interest company called Love Sober. The sort of name is on the tin, really. I felt like it was really important to create positive models of sobriety and make it aspirational, or at the very least, not absolutely, completely, and utterly terrifying for people, and just kind of like this awful life sentence. Because actually, when I realized that I was not doing very well with alcohol, because it can creep up on us. So when this happened to me, I just felt really scared. And so I really wanted to kind of spread the message that actually we can love being sober. So I do that, and I've got two books, and Love Your Sober Year is the second one. I'm a mum of two human children, and then I have chickens and guinea pigs and a dog as well. So then I also do coaching one-to-one and groups as well. So I run group programs.
I'd love to just go back to what you mentioned about when you found that you were having a problematic relationship with alcohol, how that came about for you and the steps that you took next.
It's interesting, this question, because I think the longer you go on the sober journey and you reflect and you cycle round, again, one of the reasons why Mandy and I wrote this book around the idea of cycles, is that you kind of get different layers of understanding. So how I would frame it now is quite different to if you'd asked me in the early days, I have to say. So, I mean, yeah, looking back on it, I didn't really feel that it was coming to a really big crunch point until I had children. But having said that, I was self-aware enough to go, actually, this isn't feeling good, really, even from my 20s. And that's going back, to the 90s, where it was very much, the kind of wine bar revolution, and we were drinking pints, we were matching the lads. We had Mel Sykes with Boddingtons, we had, all the, the ladette culture as well. So it was very much tied in with the cultural narrative, and my narrative about feminism and being empowered went along with drinking. So there was a lot of layers to unpick. There was a lot of that kind of story to untangle. Fast forward to kind of 30s, then late 30s, I had my children quite late. So I was just very aware that it had shifted to much more indoors because I couldn't get out. My husband was working long shifts. At this point, we'd relocated to West Sussex. We'd made the decision I was going to be at home because we don't have a lot of help. And so I found myself getting very isolated. And I had that real mum transition where it was like, okay, there's a real rite of passage here as a female that isn't really being honored, talked about, understood by me, and I don't know what to do with this. So there was me. I had my children, I had a massive identity shift, I had lots of hormones, and I felt like, my mental health wasn't great. So wine became more and more that kind of wine. I remember when I first heard the phrase wine o'clock, I roared my head off with laughter, and I thought, thank God it's not just me. So somehow it had got very much tied up with my identity as a parent, of like, that mummy wine time of, oh, I deserve this. What the hell else am I going to do? That side really then started to have a big impact on, yeah, I'd say my mental health. Hangovers were horrendous. There was also this kind of a bit of a chasm appearing. Like, I'd always been a bit like, no one would have known I had a drink problem. I always got to work. I was never, didn't get into troubles with driving or anything like that. But there was a bit of a disconnect because I was quite into health and fitness. So I did my hot yoga. I managed my stress with lots of different things. I had my hobbies. I had this kind of toolkit. Drinking was part of it. But this disconnect between actually how this is feeling, what my new role is, how it's all fitting, and it became impossible to ignore. So the self-loathing and the kind of shame spiral, once you kind of, identify that actually this is not in line with kind of what you want to be doing most of the time, but you keep doing it, that impact on you actually can create quite a lot of shame, and it can lead you on a downward spiral, because you're not setting out to do, or you're finding you're not able to do kind of what you're going, right, I'm not going to drink tonight. And then you go, oh God, Christ, I just want a glass of wine at 5 o'clock. So you don't meet that intention. So the next day, that's a little chink in your armor. That's how I see it. Another little chink. So yeah, I think I got to that point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. And I made various attempts to stop. But each time after a few days, I'd just say, well, I'd go, wow, surely you're being far too hard on yourself. And then it just came to one night where I would wreck my sleep. And I remember I logged on at 3 a.m. I'd done some decorating. This is so boring. Right? It's like, like these kind of rock and roll stories of rock bottoms. And you're like, oh, I see now why Matthew Perry is kind of completely sober. Oh, Drew Barrymore, definitely. No, I was doing some decorating, and I had always said that I really like decorating, and I didn't. It's just that I liked drinking beer when I was decorating. Kids were in bed, my husband was still at work, but I didn't have any beer in the house. And so I went into the garage, and it was like any old shit would do. So I found this bottle of Taboo, drinking this Taboo. I went to sleep and I woke up again. I don't know what it was, but I woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, heart palpitations, sweating, and just going, this has just got to stop. So I went onto the internet and Googled for about a millionth time, am I an alcoholic? And I found a website called Soberistas, and it looked a bit like a magazine. So I was like, oh, hello. That's like, okay, this doesn't have an eye with a triangle. And it was before I'd ever really used Facebook or social media. And so I blogged, and I said, look, I've never blogged before. I said, look, I don't know why I'm here really. This is me. This is what's going on. But I think I have a problem. And then I went to sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I thought, right, what do you do? And I checked it, and I had 7 messages from women saying, oh God, we get it. Like, we're just like you. Yeah, I'm a mom, and it was like, oh my goodness, I'm not alone. There are people who identify and are saying, yeah, it's almost like giving me permission to stop as well, not going, don't worry about it, taking it seriously. So at that point, I felt like there was a lifeline, and that was it really. That was the beginning of my sober journey.
What encouraged you to take it from, okay, Soberistas, I'm going to stop drinking, to actually creating Love Sober?
I also just want to say that as well to any mums kind of listening in, to that, very, very clear to say, no shame, no blame, because parenting is really hard work, especially if you don't get much support. And so I guess this does link into Love Sober, because when Mandy and I set up a podcast, Love Sober the podcast, it was one of the first ones in the UK that was alcohol free. So you can check that out if you're interested. Go back to the beginning and you can piece together the journey. It's quite funny. And yeah, that idea that somehow alcohol got kind of tied up with the real parenting movement, the honest parenting movement. And it was just because there was a real yummy mummy kind of Bowden backlit world of this is how we do it, and it all became a bit lifestyle-y. And then, thankfully there were, Instagrammers who were saying, showing like breastfeeding in the toilet, kind of going, I'm having a nightmare. But somehow alcohol then got coupled with that. We've always been really clear to say, there is no shame, no blame, but it's about asking better questions and supporting what you need. What do you need? Do you need some extra childcare? Do you need sleep? Do you need someone to come and take kids for a bit? Do you need flexible working? And we are really, really encouraged to just neck a bottle of wine and shut up. And we want to call a bit of BS on that and say, actually, no, this is we need support here. So just to kind of pop that out there to frame it. Yeah, it gave rise to Love Sober. And so what happened to me, I'm very interested in the sort of stopping. But both Mandy and I, what happened to us is, because we were doing it quite a long time ago, there weren't that many who had been on that path quite a few years. So there was still a lot of the old kind of recovery, I'm doing bubble quotes, language around, AA or stuff like that we it just didn't resonate with us. It was like, actually, that feels quite shaming in itself, or it just feels too goddish. It had to feel authentic to stick. It was like, I don't want to put anyone else's pathways down, but this has got to feel right. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not
You
going to
needed to
do it.
identify with the path.
You do, don't you? Exactly. So both of us went back to drinking after about a year because we thought, well, I've done loads of self-development. I've done it. I set out to do a year. And what I found was that very quickly I just went back to where I was before. It was like the wine, that internal chatter of, at midday, shall I, shan't I? That kicked off straight away. The anxiety came back. So, and I honestly thought I was the one person. Like, people on sober forums had said, yeah, don't do that, don't go back. And I thought I was literally the one person who could get away with that. I was like, I know, but I'm fine. I was the one person. And actually that was a real shock. So I got very interested in then, how do we stay being sober and how do we love being sober? Because I think I was still kind of white knuckling it a bit like, okay, just got to get through today. And I didn't have a toolkit around self-care. I didn't understand my sensory needs. So, or understand boundaries. I mean, honestly, there was so much. I was like, okay, so I can stop drinking, but how do I make this stick? And how do I create a life that I really love being sober? So that was the next bit of the journey. So studied, I studied really just anything I could get my hands on around positive psychology, the science of happiness. I studied an amazing all around the neurobiology of stress, which is like the vagus nerve, and how we are in fight flight a lot with chronic stress. So how do we soothe ourselves? And honest to God, that's most of the work I do with women is basically just how to manage stress without alcohol, because that's what our stress relief tool that we're given, isn't it? And I trained as a coach, and just it, Mandy and I said, let's write courses, let's coach. And then we were like, but we can't stop there. We need to kind of carry on supporting. So we've got a community of women, so a secret Facebook community, who then support each other. So it sort of grew like this. But the idea was, yeah, just to create a space and raise awareness around well-being, sustainable well-being tools for modern women, that really speak to our needs, essentially.
Can you share a bit more about who the community is open to, I guess?
Yeah, so all women, or those who identify as women. And very much we have evolved, and it has evolved a little bit more, because actually we wrote the first book, I think Love Yourself Sober is a real sort of cri de coeur of the mother. It's really all this stuff that we're talking about we need this, we need a bit of this, this is, let's call a bit of BS on this, and that was the early part of the journey. And it's kind of moved as we've grown older to then speak to that perimenopausal and menopausal piece. And now, I'm going through the menopause at the moment, and now a lot of the women are as well, and we have women who have younger children, but we also now have a lot of women who have older children who have flown the nest, or like me, who did it later on in that kind of, because that was my generation, who are going through that kind of perimenopause, menopause piece, but still have kids at home. Like, my youngest only just left primary school. So it's coping with then and thriving within those rites of passage. So it's now sort of the container has widened a bit to be that sort of, motherhood through to, perimenopause, menopause, and, as we go on, hopefully beyond.
Sounds like a beautiful and very supportive community. And again, I was nodding there because that cycle of going from being in our 20s and almost discovering ourselves through our 30s and perhaps parenthood for the first time or not, and then moving towards perimenopause and menopause, there are lots of moments in there where we're not encouraged to really look at what we need. And actually, the more we talk about that, the more we support each other and the more we pool our resources when it comes to how do we care for ourselves and each other, the better And in terms of that cycle of womanhood, I'm also interested by the talk of cycles in your amazing new book, which is Love Your Sober Year, and it's a seasonal guide to alcohol-free living. Can you share a little bit more about cycles within the context of sharing to be alcohol-free?
One thing that happens, I think a beautiful thing that happens once we've got through that early muscle power of that's required of being sober, when we, changing habits often of a lifetime or of an adult lifetime. So there is muscle power, I think, a mindset and a real kind of, you need to be a bit steely about it and focused at the beginning. But what happens after that is that there's this kind of beautiful space that opens up where you can be really intentional and have a lot of clarity about what works and what doesn't. So what happened to me is I just saw cycles everywhere in terms of what we're talking about. Okay, there's the lifestyle, the stages of life we go through. We have the cycles of every day, and I work with clients around transition times in a really cyclical way. It's not every morning we wake up, it's actually at 5 o'clock, like a cycle, like a clock. That's the trigger time. So there's that aspect. Then I know for myself that especially during those early perimenopausal years, I would get real drinking cravings at a certain time of the month. And again, this is really, really common. And before I stopped drinking, I was very unsystole because I thought PMT was, I just didn't get it. I was like, well, what is that? Like, everyone's making a fuss. And it's basically because I would drink almost like a pain relief. Over that, it would ramp up when I had my period. So, there was a lot of work to be done on it in terms of, this honoring my own cycles, and then obviously talking to other women in sober forums and working with female clients. It was very clear that we were all experiencing this. The other thing that happens is we noticed that throughout our first sober years, and anecdotally, there's not really been any academic research done on this, but what was happening was about once every 3 months, people would kind of flatline a bit and get very dispirited. So they'd be like full of vim and vigor, and then after 3 months they'd flatline. And now we work with people, with women around that, so that's fine. That's when you're ready for the next bit of growth. So that fitted really in with the seasons as well. So every 3 months we have a new season. We'll have a shift in temperature. So what cut it in the summer won't necessarily cut it in the autumn. And we're really, when we're early sober, we think, yes, I found what works. I found that. And my alcohol-free soda and lime or whatever it is, let's go a bit more adventurous. My alcohol-free Prosecco with raspberries on top in a lovely glass and sitting out in the sunshine really does it for me. And autumn comes and you think, oh, I'm feeling a little bit seasonally affective. So we need to update the toolkit. So what works now? Maybe it's like Netflix, hot chocolate. Let's get the Hugo around the house. Let's get some fairy lights up early. And, really find ways to nurture our senses and light ourselves up so we don't get, I guess, depleted. And we keep that bit of curiosity going, which is very good for motivation and habit change.
I'm so intrigued by this because as you were talking, I had pictures in my mind of myself seasonally drinking. So I had the idea of, a beer garden and, a glass of red wine by the fire, because it's so entrenched, I think, for some of us in our unwinding. And that's what I wanted to come to in terms of the resource, because you talk a lot about resource in this book, and alcohol could become a resource for some people. And I know certainly for me it has, in terms of marking the end of the day, marking the end of a project, or numbing out, numbing out, feeling lonely, perhaps being alone at home, putting on some TV and drinking till you just feel that little bit less brittle. So how do we take that resource and change it into something different?
I think if we look at it like that, it can then reframe it almost to allow more curiosity and more exploration. Because if we're just saying, right, I really mustn't do this is really bad for me, I mustn't do it, I've just got to stop, we're not going to get very far, because we were drinking in the way that you're talking about for a need, right? So to calm our nervous systems, to soothe, to mark the end of the day, a switch off point. These transition points are so important, and part of that, if I can just explain that a little bit, if we look through the kind of lens of the nervous system, we're often on the go throughout the day, and we need to come into more of a resting and digesting state. It's not sustainable. Again, this is very cyclical. So we can end up right at the end of the day in a way out of what's called our window of tolerance. So very stressed out. And then when we want to try and calm down, it can feel so uncomfortable. It can feel practically impossible and intolerable. And I find a lot of women, and myself included, drank to sort of oil the kind of gears of our nervous system. So we were coming down with what felt like a bit of a softer landing. And so we've really got to find ways to find different resources, routines, rituals, and rhythms, which is kind of what you're talking about, to help us in a way not get to that point. So watching our, as we go throughout the day, keeping a bit mindful of that, but also how would we mark that transition? If I've used wine for that, what could I do? What is the need? Okay, so for me, I just need it all to go a bit quiet. Often it's a sensory need. So to just walk, get the dog out, walk in nature if you possibly can. And, obviously, again, this is where mums find it difficult, because you can't always hand the children over. So that's very much looking at your day and trying not to get to that crisis point, if you can just build in the breaks during the day at all. So it could be that, or it could be that real, if you're kind of very sort of fighty at that point, can you go to the gym? Can you dance it out in the kitchen with some house music on, just literally get that stress out? For some people, it's that feeling of, like you said, marking the end of the day, almost like celebrating. So you might have had this drink. So how can you keep the ritual but change the ingredient? So it could be like, I've got the most beautiful crystal kind of cocktail glasses and an ice maker, and I put my Sainsbury's does a great alcohol-free fizz, and it's only £2.50. And I have that with ice in it, and then maybe I put a Monin syrup like a peach, so make a little alcohol-free Bellini, something like that. So something that really feels like a treat. So yeah, essentially those those resources we tend to find we're either wanting to bring ourselves up, cheer ourselves up, or bring ourselves down and soothe us. So it's a real kind of exploration in terms of, well, what do I love? What could I love? Let's try this out. Does this work? Not so much. I thought I might like tap dancing again. I tried it. Turns out that really was my 8-year-old self that liked tap dancing.
That inner child didn't need to be revisited in the tap
that
dancing
particular
studio.
one really didn't.
I love that. And do you know what I find so helpful about that is the pause to think about, why am I doing this? So when you were talking about, the window of tolerance and actually de-stressing and the vagus nerve, that suddenly adds another layer to the action, the demand and the action. It's not just I want a drink because it's habitual. It's I want to drink because I need to change my feelings.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's like I need to change my state. I need to, and essentially you've got, at that point, to get a bit scientific on it, if you've gone into fight flight and you've produced these adrenaline and cortisol, which needs to be burnt off, and if we can't, that's that really icky feeling you've got when you've got cortisol flooding around, and you'll need to probably move it out, shake it out. Or the other thing around that time is that actually, if you can do that and then you can kind of distract yourself enough, you will find that you'll come out of that sort of stress cycle, and you'll come out a few hours later, and that's very empowering when you realize that it passes. because those trigger times, if you think, oh God, I really, really I'm going to just take a fork to someone if I don't get that glass of wine, you know what I mean? I felt like that so much. And then I was like, oh, by 8 o'clock, I've eaten something. They're in bed. I'm watching, I won't say what I watched, it's too embarrassing. I will. It was Dallas. It was Dallas. In the early days, I watched Dallas right from the beginning. I got very interested in Sue Ellen having that, the alcohol problem, but all the rest of them having, anyway, that's another side. But whatever works for you. And then you'll find, and that bliss of just kind of your head hitting the pillow and knowing you're going to get a good sleep. I mean, as women, as we get older and as parents, there are a few precious commodities, which I think are sleep, energy, that kind of peace of mind, knowing that you're solid and you're safe. If you are drinking, those will be impacted negatively. And if you have identified you've got a problem, if you stop drinking and choose that alcohol-free option, you get all of that. You get time, you get energy, and you get peace of mind, which are like gold dust. Oh, on the other one, the big one, health, right? So those are the real kind of reasons as well to really kind of get resourced and give it a go, because it will reap dividends for you.
Absolutely. And they're the kind of bedrocks of well-being, aren't they? Especially sleep, which we know can be really impacted when we're drinking. And you've touched upon stress a lot within that. And I think we tend to think of alcohol as stress relief. But can you explain exactly why it's not?
Yeah, it really isn't. Well, basically, alcohol is what's called, they call it in the profession a dirty drug, because, and some people don't even think of it as a drug. That's the thing, because it's marketed so, cleverly, and there is a cultural narrative there as well, and probably family histories. We don't necessarily call that out. It's called a dirty drug in that it hits all of the neurotransmitters. So other drugs might just hit. So we've got GABA, which calms us down. We've got, I won't remember all of them, but acetylcholine. We've got serotonin. We probably know that, that we need to get out to get the sunlight, to get, our serotonin, which helps with depression. We've got dopamine there, which is the habit former, and that's the kind of addictive one, the dopamine hit. But historically, evolutionary, we need dopamine to remember what feels good, so we do it again. So it's for habit forming. So alcohol hits all of them, it blasts all of them, so we get a real sort of upper downer, pain relief, all the rest of it. But what happens, our brain and our bodies are so sophisticated that if we have an overload of something, we need to reach a balance called homeostasis. So the next day, when it dies off, when it drops off, our brains say, well, we've had a great big dose of that, we don't really need so much of that, so it will produce less. So that's why you won't have your GABA the next day and you'll feel anxious, or the serotonin will be depleted, so that you will have, you'll feel a little bit down. So all of these, and over time, if we repeat, the sort of the habit can then become, well, the behavior becomes the habit, becomes an addictive behavior, becomes addictive, and then the end stage obviously is this dependency. And obviously alcohol being addictive, it's that extra kind of charge for your body and brain to cope with.
I mean, that's really helpful, as it was earlier on when you talked about the changing of states, to understand what is physiologically happening to you when you have been drinking, and why there is that dip the next day, because it can be tough, that dip.
It can, and so I always find that kind of education, like good quality information about it, is really important, and we don't get a lot of that outside. Even like Drink Aware, that's supposed to give us lots of good advice, that's sponsored by alcohol and funded by big alcohol, so they still kind of want you to kind of just drink moderately. They're never going to kind of go, well, actually it's probably not a great idea. So we don't have a lot of good information, and that can be very empowering. But the other thing is that when we're in it, it feels very personal, and we have our narratives around it and our feelings and our relationship with it as well. And so that's why it's really important to build things that you love and to work creatively with yourself, with sober treats, with new rituals, with new routines, with your body, with your senses, as we've pulled together in the book. because then we work with both sides of the brain. We've got some good information, but then we've lit up our creative and emotional side, and that's actually going to lead the way if we're going to carry on making that change and essentially love being alcohol free.
And I can't tell you how helpful I think it is. I was reading it before we spoke, and just things like actually thinking about what's coming up in this season, what you want for yourself, but also where the stumbling blocks might be, where you can fall into patterns of drinking because it's just what's going to happen. You're going to a party, you're seeing people. And I think sometimes we can go from it's not the right time to stop, even though I know that this is perhaps problematic for me socially. It feels too hard. But what you do is, in this book, you put together a whole toolkit of how to prioritize yourself by thinking about this in advance, how to actually center yourself in this, rather than how will the rest of the world perceive me if I don't continue the way that I have been for their ease, even though actually it's taking away from myself.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? That the power of the pause. And as soon as we sort of, I think there's lots of deeper layers to that. I think that is so important generally in life, in parenting, in health, in everything, is that almost to give yourself that grace, that moment to sort of reflect, but also to kind of be intentional, like you say, that about what do I want this season to look like, and give ourselves permission. And essentially it's really empowering, because it's like it's us making the choices and actually saying, well, I can, they're boundaries, isn't it? It's saying, well, I can make some decisions, I can do some planning. And for me, it's self-leadership. It's very, very empowering and important, so that we're not knocked off balance. And I think, so many people that I know, I don't know if it's just a human affliction, but for women, that sort of people pleasing element, and putting people first, and that need, we need to become a little bit more boundary literate, actually. And I think as we get older and we have less energy, that becomes more and more of a kind of need to know intel, like how do we do this, because otherwise we're just going to burn out and get really depleted. So this, yeah, give ourselves a chance, really.
Most definitely. And on this season of the podcast, we've had Billy Dunlevy talking about self-esteem. We've had Tasha Bailey talking about people pleasing. And I can just see the kind of Venn diagram of all of this. There is so much about the way we interact with others and the time we give ourselves to consider what we're doing that feeds into all of this. So and you've touched on this in the book in great detail, actually, and it's just beautiful. So I would encourage you to listen to the Love Sober podcast, but also check out this book, because it does give you those moments for reflection, but also that information that we don't have on a regular basis. Just before we finish, I really wanted to touch on menopause and perimenopause and the choice of sobriety. From my own experience, I've really noticed that alcohol hits differently now, and things like red wine can prompt night sweats and hangovers and anxiety like never before. Can you share anything about this life stage and the choice to become alcohol free and how it can help?
I think, like you said, it really does hit differently. I think that's a great way of kind of putting it. Yeah, and obviously, if we're going through the perimenopause, I think there is some great work being done now, and much more awareness being raised, isn't there? People like, who's doing that, like Meg Matthews and
Davina McCall, Dr. Louise Newson.
Davina McCall, I was thinking of. And so I think it's almost a bit like alcohol, in that it was a bit of a taboo for ages to talk about. So there's a bit of a kind of synergy between those two. And again, isn't it interesting? It's around the female experience and not being able for us to be able to talk about it, to get the correct, adequate support. So I'm really heartened by the fact that, all of that's happening. But for many of us, I think that we start going through perimenopause much earlier than we think that we do. So we might think, oh, well, I better have a little think about this late 40s. But actually, I know for me, it was very early 40s where I was starting to have those dips in estrogen. It's not all the time, but we are essentially, experiencing that kind of dysregulation already. So if we put alcohol on it on top of that, it can have really bad, like you said, the night sweats. There's your liver's trying to process quite a lot as well, so that's just extra kind of on your system. There's the mental health aspect as well, that a lot of women, I think, they often there's a crossover with perimenopause and that kind of depression, and they go to the doctor and they get prescribed antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not actually looking at the right thing, and B, as well, if we're then drinking on top of that, we've got this whole cocktail going on where we're not getting to the root cause. So it is that sense that we can't process alcohol as well as we're going. There's lots about the fat, as well, in our bodies, and where we're storing it. So it is almost just that big cluster, the word that must not be said.
It can feel like it's very unfair, I think, when we get to a point where we're trying to work out what's going on with our bodies. And as you said, it's all about the female experience, which is why it's so important for things like your book and your community, the work that all of the women we were just talking about are doing, and talking to each other, but also making that time to pause, making that time to center yourself in what's happening for you.
And honor your rites of passage and needs as women. And I do feel like it's almost like we've been kind of treated like battery hens. It's like produce, produce, produce on this linear kind of pathway, and we're supposed to go at the same pace until we drop. And I mean, it's not good for men or women, but especially with for women, with the fact that we've got more of a caring load. We have more of that gender bias of people pleasing going on. We've got cyclical things going on with our bodies. We've got fluctuating hormone levels. It really is that kind of, like I talked about before, kind of self-leadership, self-care, self-awareness to really put our own health first. And like you said, that ability to pause is a key part of that.
That's incredibly helpful. I feel like I need that written and in front of me. And I'm sure a lot of other women would say exactly the same. My final question for you is, what's been your biggest revelation or your biggest learning undertaking this work?
I've got a sober app that in the early days, it counted my days, and then it counts how much money you save as well. So it's got that. And it asks you for the reason, your reason to be sober today. And I remember it is the foundational piece of self-love that allows all others. And for me, saying no to alcohol has allowed me to be present in my life, to really learn the language, become literate with Kate, like, and what she needs. So weird when people talk about themselves in third person, but it's kind of a bit like that. And also, so to really know what lights me up, and then if the shit hits the fans, have the resilience to cope with that as well. So I just feel like it's quite simply, it's like it's given me this high definition experience of my own life. It's just such a gift.
Thank you for sharing that. And it leads me actually to ask you one more question, which is, what do you think someone who is considering an alcohol-free life should know?
I'd say be curious, really be curious. Because there's a lot of things out there now. There's loads of different sober groups. So you can really find your fit. You can find your gang that you vibe with, whether it's a mum gang or a sporty gang or something more creative. Don't do it alone either. It's like much more fun when you do it with other people. Be curious about what you find out that you love, I would say, and just give it a go. Just give it a go, because there are those old kind of adages, and obviously it depends. If you were drinking daily and you were drinking throughout the day and you were physically, chemically dependent on it, this is not the advice for you. You need to go see your GP and get some intervention help. But for many of us who sort of identify as that kind of gray area drinker of, well, it's just become a bit too much of a habit, just know that things will land. If you're curious, you might not do it this time, but you'll learn something, and then you can give it another go. Just be curious and compassionate.
Hey, I love your approach. I love the no pressure, no blame. Find out more about yourself and see what lights you up. I think it's a really good place to start this from if anyone's considering joining Love Sober or getting the book or just thinking about their relationship with alcohol. So I thank you for this. It's been a lovely, illuminating conversation, and I've personally taken away a lot from it as well. So can you just share the title of your book and where people can find you before we finish?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's called Love Your Sober Year, and you can buy it from wherever you get your books from online. I don't know which bookshops it's in at the moment, but yeah, so you can get it. You can get it online from wherever you buy your books.
Great. And if people want to contact you?
The best way to find me is to check out lovesober.com, and you can find out everything that we do there. And you can also find me on Instagram at lovesober.cic.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.